Tantor Audio presents Natural Ordermage by L.E. Modesitt, Jr. Narrated by Kirby Heyborne. Land's End 1. Rahl, how are you coming on Tales of the Founders? In the light of a spring afternoon, Kyan glanced across the workroom toward his younger son, seated behind the battered but spotless oak copying table. The two south windows were glazed and overlarge for the workroom, but the light they provided made the work far easier. "I've just finished the embellishments on the bottom of the last page in the 4th chapter. The black-haired apprentice scrivener smiled politely. "I'm copying those exactly as they are. That's what you wanted, wasn't it?" Rahl knew well that was what his father desired, but he'd also learned that such questions reassured the master scrivener. "After you finish that, would you check the next batch of ink? I worry about the latest oak galls we got from Kleindal, and the iron brimstone." Kyan carefully set the copper-tipped iron-pointed pen down on the blotting pad, well away from the inkwell. "Folks don't take the care they used to. Not at all. It was bad enough in my father's time, but these days—" Rahl finished the last stroke, then cleaned his pen and set it aside. "I'll check that ink now, while the embellishment is drying." "Don't take too long. I promised that copy to Zytol before the turn of summer." Rahl was well aware of that. His father mentioned it at least once a day, but the youth said nothing as he made his way out of the workroom, past the angled and padded shelf set before the small glass display window. On the shelf were sheets of parchment, samples of Kyan's handwork, and a thin black-bound copy of the Council Ordinances. Rahl had actually copied some of that, but only a master scrivener would have been able to tell. So much like his father's was his hand, especially when he used standard hand style. The oak door was propped ajar to let in the fresher air of spring, and Rahl had to move the heavy square gray stone blocks that served as doorstops in order to open the door wide enough to let himself out. He also had to be careful not to hit his head on the doorframe, since the door and frame had been built for Kyan's sire, a man almost half a cubit shorter than Kyan, and close to a full cubit shorter than Rahl. Once he was outside, he replaced the doorstops immediately to forestall any words from his father. The late afternoon sun had almost touched the top of the hills to the west, and the shadow of the structure that held both shop and dwelling stretched almost to the far side of the narrow paved street. If Rahl had walked to the corner, he could have looked northward and downhill to the small harbor at Land's End. Instead, he walked around the house to the small brick shed set a good 10 yards back of the rear covered porch and beside the grape arbor. A third of the shed was for ink and binding preparation, and the remainder was where his mother wove and stored her baskets before she sold them. The arbor ran from the southwest corner of the porch due west and parallel to the shed. Beyond the shed were the low square walls that held the compost heap that he periodically took from to fertilize his mother's garden. The garden itself stretched another 10 yards beyond the shed to the stone wall that marked the beginning of the protected forest, such as it was, with its low pines. Rahl slipped the catch on the shed door and stepped inside, where he checked each of the covered glazed pots that held the ink. The ink was setting up properly, as it should, although it had taken just a touch of order to stabilize the iron brimstone. The brimstone had been a touch excessive, but Rahl had managed. He'd never told his parents of his small order abilities. The last thing in the world he wanted was to undergo instruction in the use of order by the magisters, and risk exile and danger geld. Besides, his abilities were modest, and he'd never even tried to use them other than for good results, even with the girls. Even though he sensed that the ink would be fine, he dipped a thin strip of reed paper in the first pot, another in the second, then held them away from him to dry. After a moment, he covered the pots again and left the shed. He was careful to relatch the door and to keep the ink-damp paper from touching his tunic. His mother would berate him all too thoroughly if he were careless enough to get ink anywhere but on his hands and blotting pad, and especially if he got ink on any of her reeds and grasses. If he ended up with much ink on his hands, he'd hear about it from his father. At the separate outside door to the shop, he bent and moved the outside doorstop, then stepped inside and replaced it. He straightened and carried the 2 thin strips to Kian. "Here you are, sir." Kian set aside his pen once more. His eyes studied the strips. Then he smelled them. Finally he pressed them against his blotting pad. "Getting there. Not quite, but they'll be ready before we finish off this batch." He looked up at Rahl. "Best get back to copying. Book won't copy itself, Rahl." "Yes, sir." Rahl slipped back to the smaller copying desk, where he settled himself onto the square woven reed seat of the stool, backless, unlike the one used by his father. He opened the original of Tales of the Founders, and his eyes read the next few lines. Shira was in those days the guard captain of the West Wind Guards, and her twin blades were near as mighty as those of Kreslin and Majera, and her skill as an instructor in arms was unsurpassed. In less than 3 years, she and Captain Heil created the Guards of Recluce, more than 5 squads, each squad more than a match for 5 squads of the best blades from any other land. Rahl suppressed a snort. 5 times as effective? He paused. The original Guards of Recluce had eventually become the Guards of the Council, and his brother Cassett was one of those guards at the garrison at Reflin. More than once Cassett had told him stories of how comparative handfuls of marine guards had boarded pirate vessels and destroyed entire pirate crews. From his own senses, Rahl had known Cassett had not been lying. His eyes dropped back to the book. Still, 5 times as effective? Even against the Crimson of Hamor? 2. Only a single oil lamp sat upon the oblong oak table. Spotless and shining as the glass mantle was, or had been, the light in the chamber was dim, because the wick barely protruded over the edge of the brass flange of the wick tube. Kian sat at the head of the table, his back to the kitchen area, with Corlia to his right, and Rahl across from him. Rahl took another spoonful of the barley and fowl soup. It was really thick enough to be a stew, but he'd learned years before that no matter how thick it was, if his mother called it a soup, it was a soup. He added a small dollop of the cherry conserve to the chunk of fresh bread on the edge of the platter that held the old ochre soup bowl. He would have preferred dark bread with the soup, but molasses was getting dear again. Or so his mother had said. So he took another small spoonful of the stew soup, and then added another dollop of conserve to the bread. He'd learned as a small boy that small dollops were seldom noticed the way heaping spoonfuls were, particularly by his mother. After several more small spoonfuls of the soup, he added a last small portion of conserve to the bread, and took a bite. "Good bread, Mother," he said, after chewing his mouthful deliberately. "It's always good. So is the soup. We do the best we can. Of course, we might have done better in Nyland." Corlia glanced at her consort. "They have more coins for decorative work." Kian ignored the sideways look. "Excellent soup. Couldn't get barley this good down south, not near Nyland." "No, but the fowl would be cheaper," countered Corlia. "Both Land's End and Nyland are better than Reflin, aren't they?" asked Rahl. "That's like saying a snug cot and a mansion are better than a hut," replied Corlia. "Anyway, we're probably better here. Now." Kian looked up, clearly surprised. They say that the black engineers of Nylon are working on a machine that will copy many books at one time, offered Corlia. They won't need scriveners before long. Who are these people who say that? Asked Kian dryly. Eldonia. Her brother is a road patroller between Skill and the Black Wall of Nylon. How many people have repeated what he said? Skill is 700 k's or more from Land's End. Cassett says that the engineers are always working on things, Corlia added. That's why they're engineers. But not everything they make is good for everyone. That's why the wall is there and why the council is here in Land's End. I can't see the council allowing a machine, even one bound in order, to replace the honest work of a scrivener. And that's if they can even build something that works. Rahl concealed a smile. His father, as good and solid a scrivener as he was order blind. The order in his life resulted from following the rules and careful habit. Kian couldn't have felt order or chaos if a black mage had arrived and filled the small dwelling with it, or if one of the white wizards of Fairhaven had descended on white lightnings from the sky. So far, that had worked to Rahl's advantage. Still, he was careful to avoid any of the black mages. Because Kian was a scrivener and considered a learned man, Rahl had left school earlier than many others his age, and before he'd begun to realize his small abilities with order. While he doubted he had that much order ability, he had no desire to call attention to himself. He had a roof over his head, good food, if plain, and plenty of time before he had to settle down. What do you think about Tales of the Founders? Asked Kian. You're reading it as well as copying it, aren't you? Yes, sir. Rahl paused slightly. He usually did in answering his father's questions, both to give himself a moment to think and to create the impression of thoughtfulness, even when he didn't need the time. I've only read what I've copied, but I don't think the writer is telling the whole story. That happened more than 500 years ago, replied Kian dryly. And you know that he left something out? Rahl laughed easily. Yes, sir. All stories leave something out. Otherwise they'd go on forever and say little in too many words. It's like copying a book. You don't tell a customer all the things you do to make the book, from the binding and gluing to the illustrations and embossing, if it has any. You just say that you copied it. Books are like that. They don't tell what people have for every meal. Of course not, snorted Kian. But that doesn't change things. You're talking about something else. Say what you mean. Rahl wished he hadn't said so much. Still, he offered a smile. The story says that Kreslin was a master blade, and that he killed scores of Hamorians, but it also says that he was raised in the legend in Westwind, where no men bear arms. It doesn't say how he became a master blade. You're always telling me that to be good at anything I have to study and work and practice. That's got to be true for a master blade, too. But there's nothing about that. It's a legend, replied Kian. They leave things out. Rahl refrained from pointing out that he had just said that, suppressing his irritation at the fact that his father had ignored what he'd said just a few moments before. His father always ignored what was inconvenient. It's interesting, though. I'd like to know how he and Majera ever got together. She was supposed to be all chaos, and he was all order. Opposites attract, suggested Corlia. That's something you'll need to watch out for when it's time for you to choose a consort. Great attraction beforehand sometimes means greater conflict afterward. He's got a consort to be, woman, if he'd only look. Shahyla is as good a catch as any young fellow could want. With but her one brother, she'll hold all the upper pastures and half the herds one day. Bradian's getting greyer and frailer every 8 day. Rahl nodded politely. One way or another, Shahyla was not going to be his consort. She was pleasant enough and not bad-looking, but from what he recalled from when they had been in school together, she had the curiosity of a milk cow and the brains of a stone wall. "That's if Bradion doesn't take a liking to some other young fellow in his family." Corlia looked to her son. "You'll be needing to pay her a call on the end days. I'll bake you a honey cake to take with you. You can't be calling empty-handed. Will you make the kind with the almonds?" "We might be having some left," Corlia said. "I'll see." "You're spoiling him," replied Cain. "It's not for him, remember, dear. It's for Bradion and Shahyla. Poor man has no consort, and I hear tell that Shahyla's so tied up with the milk cows and the creamery, she's no time to bake properly." "I suppose it can't hurt." Cain pursed his lips. "Be there enough for a small one for us?" Corlia laughed. "I could manage that, I'm sure." Rahl finished the last of the heavy soup, and then took the last mouthful of bread, the corner with the most of the conserve on it. He liked having a bit of sweetness at the end of a meal. "Might I be excused?" he asked. "Where are you going?" asked Corlia. "It's a pleasant evening. I've been inside all day. I'm going to take a walk. If Sevian's around, we'll play plaques. Otherwise, I won't be late." "Don't be late at all," suggested Cain. "You need the sleep for a steady hand. I promised that copy by summer. Good copying can't be rushed. Means steady days every day." "Yes, sir." "Let him go, Cain. I recall someone who sneaked back through the shutters more than once." "Was different then," muttered the scrivener. His son and consort laughed. Before Cain or Corlia could say more, Rahl smiled and slipped off the bench and toward the door. "Not too late," called Cain. "Yes, sir." Outside the house, in the fading twilight, Rahl stopped beside the pump and the cistern. Each house had one, fed by pipes from the springs supposedly found or created by the Black Order mastery of Kreslin hundreds of years before. He washed up carefully, brushed the dust off his brown tunic, and smoothed his hair back in place. Then he checked the truncheon at his belt. With a smile, he walked out to the street and turned southward. At the next corner, just short of Alamat the Weaver's place, he turned left and followed the street to the end, where a small wooden gate stood closed between two waist-high stone walls. Rahl unlatched the gate, entered the orchard, and closed the gate behind him. The pear-apple blossoms had mostly fallen onto the sparse grass between the trees, and then faded into a white transparency, but there remained a faint scent, particularly around the trees in the higher and slightly colder southwest corner. He walked silently down the line of trees toward the small storage barn with its closed and angled doorway that led down to the fruit cellar. To the right was an old wooden bench. Rahl took a rag from his tunic and wiped it off, then sat down. After a time, he cupped his hands and concentrated, then did his best to imitate the soft call of a rat owl. "Too-hoo!" While he waited, he listened, but all he heard were the sounds of insects and the faint whisper of leaves in the light and intermittent breeze. Before that long, he could sense a feminine presence slipping away from the house. He stood, but said nothing, as Gianella neared. She wore a sleeveless summer tunic and loose trousers, and carried something, a cloak, perhaps, although the night was warm for mid-spring. He took her hand. "I hoped you'd hear. I was afraid you wouldn't come. Father's doing his accounts tonight, and Mother's over at Aunt Denya's. They're working on the consorting quilt for Jared. He's getting consorted. Rahl couldn't imagine anyone putting up with the hot-tempered Jared, especially since Jared wasn't the brightest copper in the wallet. It's sort of a secret, with Coerlin. She's... I know, but he's been seeing her for a long time, and Father and Mother finally gave in. Rahl had the feeling that Coerlin and Jared might be having an addition to their soon-to-be family somewhat sooner than might ordinarily be the case. We might as well sit down. He gestured. I brought an old blanket. The bench can be hard, and it's dirty. Rahl took the blanket, folding it twice and laying it on the wood. Then he gestured for Gianella to sit down. You always make me feel special. He settled beside her. That's not hard. You are. Carefully, oh so carefully, he brushed her with just a touch of order. Doing that, he'd discovered, not only left the girls with fairer and smoother skin, but also tended to make them more receptive to his caresses. Did I tell you that you're beautiful? Rahl let his fingers caress Gianella's hand, then brushed back her long brown hair, his fingertips barely grazing her long neck. Her eyes dropped shyly. You're kind, Rahl, but I'm not beautiful. Not like Hermana. Beauty is more than blonde hair and blue eyes. He smiled warmly, then added, A kind heart and a welcoming smile are more beautiful. Every time you smile, I want to smile back. You must tell all the girls that. I haven't told a single one that. He hadn't, and Gianella did have a nice smile. Besides, he tried to tell the truth about each girl. Truthful was always best, especially on Recluce. After all, they each were special in different ways, and there was no reason not to let each one know her best features. He squeezed her hand gently. Your smile is special. For a moment, neither spoke. What did you do today? He asked. It had to be more interesting than what I did. I just sat at the table and copied, and thought of you. He had thought of her, if not all that often. I helped Father in the morning, culling the fruit buds that were too crowded or wrong, and then worked in the house and barn with Mother. At least you got to move around. You don't just sit there and copy all day, do you? Not all day. He laughed quietly. I did go out to the shed and check on the next batches of ink, and I cut some rushes for Mother. He squeezed her hand gently once more, then leaned forward and brushed her cheek with his lips. We're too close to the house, she whispered. Let's go up to the corner of the orchard. The grass is soft there, and you can still smell the pear-apple blossoms. Father won't hear us there. Are you sure? He asked softly. She leaned forward and kissed his cheek, gently. Very sure. He stood, giving a hand to Gianella. Then he lifted and folded the blanket over his left arm, before offering his right to her. As they walked up toward the corner of the orchard, Rahl moved easily and confidently. He had a solid feel for where things were in the dark, as well as for other matters. 3. Rahl wasn't too late getting home, just late enough that his parents were already half asleep and relieved that he had returned. He'd gone to bed happily, with pleasant memories of the evening, and Gianella. It had been her idea, even if he had encouraged it subtly. The next morning he was up as usual, just one moment before his mother was about to yell. He had to gulp down breakfast, gruel and bread, then get on with his chores. Finally, he made it to the workroom, where he settled into copying Tales of the Founders. Might be better if you got up a mite earlier, suggested Kyan. Your mother was reaching for the spare frying pan, the big iron one, and you were supposed to spar with me before we got to work. You're still not good enough with that truncheon, and there are times when a man needs to be able to defend himself." "Yes, sir." Rahl hadn't realized about the frying pan, but he sensed his father was telling the truth about it and his sparring. Why did they always want more? It wasn't as though he were a child anymore. He was up in time, and he worked hard. He did his chores, and he didn't complain, yet whatever he did was never quite enough. He pushed back that retort and concentrated on the copying before him. The morning was long and uninterrupted. Not a single person came by, either to have a letter written or to purchase anything. Rahl was more than ready when his mother called, "Dinner's ready!" He still was careful to clean and rack his pen, cap the inkwell, and close the copy of Tales of the Founders from which he had been copying. Dinner was far heartier than breakfast had been or supper would be. There were chunks of mutton and brown gravy and roasted potatoes and freshly baked bread. Of course, there were dandelion greens and winter roots, but the roots didn't taste bad in the gravy, and the greens were fresh. Rahl only managed 2 mouthfuls before his mother cleared her throat. "Rahl?" "Yes, Mother." He didn't like the feel behind the way she pronounced his name. "Alamat's niece, Quileria, said you didn't go to Sevian's last night. She saw you going through Dostak's orchard." Corlia looked at her son. "I'd hate to see you get tied up with Gianella. She's pretty enough, but she'll have nothing. The orchard's barely large enough to support Dostak and his family, and she's got 2 older brothers. Word is that even the younger one's going to be consorted before long, and to Coelin, drover's daughter, and she doesn't so much as have a single copper penny to her name. And Gianella, she'll not have much more than that, not with those 2 good-for-nothing louts they call her brothers. 3 families'll have to live off that orchard, 4 if you count Dostak and Arila." "She is pretty," Rahl admitted, "but I don't intend to get tied up with anyone now. I'm too young to take a consort." Why were they always nagging him about a consort? "Intentions are all well and good, Rahl," interjected Kian, "but actions count more than intentions, and there are grass stains on the cuffs and sides of your trousers." Rahl managed not to flush. "There's enjoying being young," added Kian, "and there's stupidity." "It'd be stupid to have to consort a girl with nothing," said Corlia. Left unsaid was the point that his father had little enough. Scriveners seldom did, especially those who did not work for the council in Land's End. "A girl's looks fade fast in life," continued his mother, "so you'd best find one with something other than looks. It's better to find one with coins for a dowry, but even one who's hard-working, or one who can help with your scrivening would be better than Gianella. She's sweet, but she has little enough in the way of brains, and less than that in coins." Rahl understood all Corlia was saying. He generally agreed with her, and he had no intention of consorting Gianella. He just wished his mother would stop hammering him with her words. She didn't know when to stop. "It only takes once to trap a young fellow," Kian added. Not in this case, thought Rahl, especially since he'd been careful and counted the days since her time of the month. He still had some time to enjoy her favors. Rather than argue or reveal anything, he just nodded and took a swallow of the weak ale, enjoying it since they often did not have it. Despite the hearty meal, Rahl was more than glad to leave the table and follow Kian back to the workroom and the copying table. He settled himself on his stool and opened the book from which he was copying. "How are you coming on that, son?" I'm about finished with the first part. Kreslin and Majera have been
Sample complete. Ready to continue?